She raised her blade over the sleeping soldier, but what she saw made her hesitate. The blade widowed ash clouds hadn't settled yet. Smoke hissed from broken shuttle cores and snapped wires, the ground still pulsing with the last static remnants of orbital fire. In that ruin, scorched and blackened like the bones of a giant, Ravka stalked silently over crushed plating and steaming debris. She moved like she had no home, only the instinct to hunt, to finish what had begun. Her eyes were not soft like those of her kin before the fall of their warrior moons. They were sharp, merciless, and glowed faint orange in the soot-covered light. In her hand was a jagged obsidian blade, alien in form, serrated like a saw, forged from the bones of something no human had ever seen and survived. She had no rank, no flag. She was a wildling now exiled, cast off, feared even by those who once knelt before her. It had been that way since the day she tore her crest from her own armor and spit it onto the feet of her dying commander. They called her traitor. She called herself alive, and then she found him. The human soldier was half buried under collapsed wreckage, his right side soaked in blood, but his pulse strong enough to stir the dust near his lips. His eyes were open ice blue, strange and unwavering. Ravka tightened her grip on her blade as she stood over him. She expected fear. She expected trembling, pleading, or even a pitiful attempt to reach for a weapon. But he didn't move. He didn't even blink. He looked at her like she was the one caught beneath rubble. "Well," he rasped, breath catching on a cracked rib, "do it then. You're not the first to try." Ravka narrowed her eyes, her lip curled, but still something in her froze. He had no shield, no armor worth the word anymore, no comrades to speak of, and yet he didn't flinch as she crouched low, bringing her knife within inches of his throat. "You don't even know who I am," she growled. "No," he said calmly, "but I know you didn't kill me the second you saw me. So either you're bad at your job, or you're curious." Her blade wavered. She hated him for saying that, for being right, for staring through her like the blood on her hands didn't matter. She had slit the throats of 20 humans in that last skirmish alone. She should have carved him open without a word, and yet here she was, frozen in the ruins. Ravka circled him slowly, her boots crunching on scorched fragments of a blown fusion engine. The silence between them stretched like a wire under tension. Any touch would snap it. The human's gaze never left her, that infuriating calm of his, that insolent serenity in a man surrounded by death made her want to scream. She could hear his heartbeat, slow, deliberate, like he was pacing himself. Her kind had evolved to hear such things, vital rhythms, fear shifts, the breath hitches that betrayed lies. And this one, he wasn't lying. He wasn't even afraid. "You're wounded," she said, more to herself than to him. He raised an eyebrow. "You think?" She almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she crouched and pressed the flat of her blade against his exposed ribs. "Why joke? You're going to die. Then let me look at you one last time. You're worth staring at, even if you're my executioner." She blinked. That was not a survival tactic. That was not begging or bluffing. That was something else entirely. "I should cut your throat for saying that," she whispered, not moving the blade. He exhaled, sharp, but amused. "Go ahead. If that's the last thing I ever say, I'm good with it." Her breath caught. Something cracked in her, not loudly, not visibly, but she could feel it like a fracture in the hardened callus around her heart. She pushed the blade harder, but not enough to break skin. "You're very stupid," she said. "I get that a lot." She stared at him for a long time, then pulled the blade back and let it drop beside her. She didn't know why she did that. Her instincts screamed, her training screamed, but her hands were trembling. No one had ever made her hesitate, not until this broken, bleeding human told her she was worth looking at. And now, for the first time since she was cast into exile, Ravka didn't feel like a predator. She felt seen. Hours passed, and the sky over the shattered battleground darkened with a slow planetary dusk, like the planet itself was mourning something. Ravka sat near him, but not close, watching with arms crossed, blade within reach. She hadn't moved since dropping it. Neither had he. There was a kind of equilibrium in that stillness, like the battlefield itself had drawn a circle around them, daring the galaxy to interrupt. "You're still alive," she said flatly, eyes locked on the slow rise and fall of his chest. "Disappointing," he replied, voice cracked from thirst but somehow still laced with humor. "You talk too much." "I do when I'm not bleeding out alone." She rose without a word and walked toward the remains of a down supply drone smoldering not far away. Her movements were swift, lethal, instinctive. She pried open the twisted paneling with her bare hands, muttering in her language, a dialect older than most humans had even existed, until she pulled out a cracked ration pack and a tiny med injector. It wasn't much, but it would slow the bleeding and numb the pain. When she returned to him, he didn't flinch. He only raised his brow again and muttered, "So you are curious. I'm making sure you live long enough to explain what the void is wrong with you," she replied, injecting the serum into his neck without ceremony. He winced slightly, and for the first time she noticed something strange. His hands, despite the pain, the exhaustion, were still steady. He wasn't pretending to be brave, he simply was. "What's your name?" she asked softly, unexpectedly. He blinked, surprised. Kale Ren." She studied the name like it had layers, like it might betray him somehow. "You're not like the other soldiers. Not really a soldier anymore. I was a combat medic, then a rescue tech. Now I guess I'm just yours." She looked up sharply, but he was already fading, eyelids heavy. "Drug. Working. Sleep. Kale Ren," she murmured without realizing she'd said it aloud. "I haven't decided if I'm killing you yet." And though his eyes closed, she could swear he smirked as sleep took him. The next morning broke with shrieking winds and drifting ash that danced like burnt snow. Rafka had moved him during the night to the hollowed carcass of an ancient transport vehicle, its frame curled like an iron rib cage, shielding them from the storm. Kale stirred as light broke across his bruised cheek. His eyes met hers immediately, as if waking was just another part of their stare. "You carried me," he said, voice thick with disbelief. "You're not that heavy," she replied without looking at him. "I've carried bigger beasts. Smelled better ones too." He chuckled and coughed, blood flecking his lip. She handed him water without a word. No thanks, no conversation, just survival. Just her quiet, impossible presence that made death seem like a distant planet. "I know who you are now," he said after drinking. She turned toward him with narrowed eyes. "You're Rafka of the Viral Outcasts. They used to call you the Blade Widow. Said you left a trail of bodies from the frost moons to the outer fire sectors. And yet you still let me carry you." She snapped. "I didn't let you. I just knew you wouldn't drop me." Her jaw tightened. She hated that he said things like that, true things. He spoke them like they were weapons, and they struck harder than any blade she'd ever wielded. "You should be afraid of me," she said. "Why?" he asked. She didn't answer, because the truth clawed at her throat. She didn't want him to be. He shifted, painfully, trying to sit upright. She helped without thinking. Their hands touched hers, calloused and dry, his bloodied and warm, and when their eyes met again, that tremor inside her returned. Not fear, not pity, but something wild and quiet and burning, something more dangerous than war. Kale looked at her, not as a legend, not as a weapon, but as a woman. And Rafka, the exiled warrior of the Ashuns, felt her blade finally grow dull, because she no longer wanted to kill what made her feel alive. The days that followed blurred together in rhythms of healing and silence. Kale's wounds mended slowly, helped by the last of the medical supplies Rafka salvaged from the wreckage. She rarely spoke, only barked orders, hunted food, or reinforced their temporary shelter with scrap metal, bones, and plasma-scorched cloth. But something in the way she moved around him had changed, less like a prisoner watching over her prey, and more like a companion unsure how to be. One night, when the fire hissed low and the winds howled like ancient beasts through the wrecked mountain pass, Kale would ask her questions, quietly, respectfully. Sometimes she answered, sometimes she didn't, but each time she chose to answer, something shifted in the air, like a crack in the walls of her exile. He learned that she had once stood atop war cruisers as they burned enemy fleets from the sky, that she was born into a warrior caste that crowned their children with blood before they could walk, that her people made her a symbol of vengeance after the death of their last empress, that she had been promised to a general she hated, and when she killed him at their coronation feast, she was hunted by her own bloodline. "They call me outlaw," she said once, sharpening her blade by the fire. "But I was never in their law, just chained to it." Kale sat across from her, his hands working on the repurposed beacon transmitter he'd been assembling for days. He didn't flinch at her confessions. He only said, "Maybe it's time someone rewrote the laws." She looked at him then, not with suspicion, but with something slower, heavier, like the moment before a star collapses into light. That night, as she fell asleep near him for the first time, she didn't wear her armor. And Kale didn't ask why. The Beacon fired 3 days later. Kale had finished tuning the fractured relay crystal using pieces from Rovka's broken plasma rifle and his own med implant controller. The signal it sent wasn't a rescue ping, it was encrypted. An old Earth Ranger. Call code that might, just might, bring help. Rovka hadn't stopped him. She just sat on a high ledge overlooking the valley, watching the sky for ships that might come bearing guns or chains or both. Why are you still here? She asked when he joined her. Kale leaned against the jagged rock beside her. Because this isn't over yet. Because I think you've never once in your life been looked at like your home instead of a weapon. She turned her head sharply, expression unreadable. You speak like you want something. I do, he said softly. I want you to stop believing you were meant to be alone. She looked away fast. The air between them tightened. She'd been called monster, tyrant, traitor. She had been offered thrones soaked in blood and turned them to ash. But no one had ever told her she was allowed to belong. You humans, she muttered, trying to sound amused, but her voice cracked, always trying to fix broken things. Kale smiled faintly. Some of us were broken too. We just remember what it felt like. She stared at him, and this time she didn't look away. She reached for his hand slowly, like drawing a sword, and curled her fingers around his palm. Her calluses met his scars, and neither of them flinched. Ships might come, war might follow. But in that moment, Rovka, the Blade Widow, sat beside a human man with no armor, no rank, no fear. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a mistake carved into a myth. The fourth night after the beacon ignited, the storm broke, not rain, not lightning, but a war storm, an orbital burst from above laced with hunter drones and blood-marked skimmers belonging to the Black Warden Syndicate. They came not for Kale, but for her. For Rovka, the queen who never claimed her throne, the outlaw warrior too dangerous to leave breathing in exile. Their ships dropped through the clouds like scythes through old wheat, and the mountain rumbled. With ancient warning, Kale grabbed his rifle, still limping from his wounds. Rovka was already halfway up the ridge, shouting over the roar of incoming fire, her blade in one hand, an old fusion core bomb in the other. He followed her without hesitation, despite the drones slashing past, the missiles gouging deep into the slope. Together they reached the old plateau, and there, surrounded by fire and ruin, they stood back to back, a medic and a monster against an army that didn't care if either bled. Kale fired, marking targets, drawing their attention. Rovka moved like war itself, fluid, brutal, her blades singing through armored drone throats, her eyes glowing with a light Kale had never seen before. She wasn't just surviving now, she was protecting him. She threw her body into the line of fire without thinking, catching shrapnel meant for him, slicing down an entire wave of Scarman's steelborn warriors with one arm going numb and the other slick with her own blood. When the last hunter fell, twitching at their feet, Kale caught her as she staggered. You're hurt, he gasped, lowering her into cover. I've been hurt since the day I was born, she whispered, eyes flickering with exhaustion. But now someone finally noticed. He pressed a medic patch to her wound, biting down the panic rising in his throat. I'll carry you, he said, trembling. No, she said, grabbing his collar with one bloodied hand. You'll stand with me. I am not your queen, Kale. I am your equal. And if I die, I'll die beside the only man who saw through the blood. Dawn came like a ghost. The storm had passed, and with it the threat of death for now. The plateau smoldered. The corpses of machines and warriors littered the slope like rusted offerings. Kale leaned against a half-destroyed boulder, one arm slung uselessly from his shoulder, his side wrapped in scorched gauze. Rovka knelt before a shattered helm, her own hands shaking as she washed blood from her face with melted ice runoff. He watched her in silence, no crown on her head, no throne behind her, just a woman made of scars and silence. And then she turned, slowly, rising to her feet, her blade sheathed for the first time in days. She walked to him slowly, painfully, but with purpose. And without a word, she dropped to one knee before him. Kale blinked in disbelief. What are you doing? Something I've never done for any commander, king or god, she said, her voice barely a breath. I'm going to a man who never asked me to bleed for him, who never demanded I change, who held me like I was already whole. He knelt too, cupping her cheek in his trembling hand. You never had to bow, he said. I was yours the moment you didn't kill me. They kissed beneath the rising smoke, the air filled with ruin and snowlight, not as warrior and prisoner, not as queen and savior, but as something older than both, a promise wrapped in blood and fire, finally kept. The rescue ship came too. Days later, it cut through the high-altitude winds with thunderless grace, old Earth Ranger insignia painted in faded gray across its flanks, as if the galaxy itself had forgotten what humans used to stand for. Kale's beacon had reached one of the last wandering patrol's survivors like him, remnants from a war that ended without their permission. The ship hovered low above the plateau, cautious, scanning for hostiles, but all they saw was wreckage and two beings standing together in its ashes. Kale waved weakly at the sky, his body still stitched with pain, barely able to stand. Ravka stood beside him, her arm across his shoulders, not just to help him walk, but to claim him as hers. When the boarding ramp dropped, the crew stepped out with weapons drawn, pausing in confused silence at the sight of a human and a Viral warrior queen leaning into one another like lovers at the end of a legend. No one moved until the ranking officer, a woman with grizzled eyes and steel gray hair, stepped forward. "You Kale Ren?" "I was," he said, voice rough. "Now I think I'm just a part of her story." The woman looked at Ravka, her war marks, her blade, her scars, and to everyone's surprise, lowered her weapon first. They let them on board without a question. No one dared stop a queen who didn't ask for permission. The ship took them far beyond the smoke-stained ridges and broken battlefields of that forgotten planet. They stayed silent during the journey, Kale in the medbay, his wounds finally seeing real care. Ravka sat near him each night, staring out into the warp stream where stars folded like ribbons in a child's hands. She had spent most of her life running, fighting, burning, surviving, but now there was nowhere left to run from. He had seen her unmasked, and he had stayed. They were offered sanctuary by the Earth Remnant Alliance, a home on a terraformed moon where no one knew her name. Ravka refused the crown her people tried to force on her once the news of her survival reached them. "I only bow to one man," she told the emissaries, "and he doesn't need a palace." Kale built a forge in their new home, something quiet, simple. He fixed weapons, yes, but also toys, tools, prosthetics, and every so often a broken music chip someone thought was beyond repair. Ravka hunted the hills alone sometimes, but always returned by nightfall, always found his arms, always slept with her hand resting on his chest, over the scar that nearly took him from her. And once, during one blue dusk, she took a small ring from her belt made from the metal of the sword she once raised above his throat and said in a low, fierce voice, "If I asked you to bind yourself to me by warrior's vow, not as ruler or prisoner, but as my mate, would you?" Kale smiled, took her hand, and said, "Only if you promise never to bow to me again." She laughed for the first time in years. But she did bow once more on their wedding day, not because she had to, but because no galaxy could stop a woman who chose her home.